In this episode of the Education of a Value Investor podcast, I'd like to introduce you to Georgina Godwin. Georgina's going to be doing some of the interviews going forwards. Georgina is a well-known radio personality. Today she hosts a number of shows on Monocle Radio, and actually that's how I met her. She invited me to join her on a conversation about my book. It turns out that Georgina and I have a number of things in common. Perhaps most importantly, having both been born in Africa and having decided not to live in Africa, but missing Africa, in Georgina's case, Zimbabwe, and in my case, South Africa. So there follows an interview between me, or a conversation between me and Georgina, as a way of allowing you to not be surprised when it's Georgina doing the interview of some people subsequent to this. I hope you enjoy the conversation with Georgina Godwin. And I urge you to also go over to Monocle Radio and look for her episodes there. She's a wonderful interviewer. Unlike me, I'm an amateur. Georgina's professional at doing radio. Thanks. So I'm sitting here with Georgina Godwin, and I wanted to introduce you to her. First of all, she's interesting in her own right, but as I've told you, I'm going to be asking her to interview some people and some of the episodes will be hosted by Georgina. So Georgina, thanks for joining.
It's really lovely to be here. And the main thing is that I think the people that you've interviewed so far, it's been fascinating. And I'm kind of flattered that you think that I can do this because, of course, I'm not a financial person. I'm not an economist. I'm not an investor. And I don't really know much about that side of what it is that you do. But I guess what I bring to it is that I have interviewed thousands and thousands of people. And I love it. I think that the key thing about an interview is just being genuinely curious. And I am about everyone I meet. I almost stop people in the street to get their life story. So I love the idea of sitting down with people that you have identified as interesting, who don't necessarily want to talk about finance, but who just want to have a chat with someone who I hope will get the best out of them.
Yeah, and I think that if you listen to the contrast between the way I end up talking to somebody or the way Georgina talks to somebody, you'll see or you'll hear the difference between somebody who knows what they're doing and somebody who doesn't know what they're doing when it comes to talking to people. But my experience has been that choosing to work with people who are very different to you. So I'm a finance guy, but the way the technology's evolved is I can pull out a microphone and start interviewing people. So I can do that, but I will never be able to replicate did you say thousands of interviews that you've done?
I feel really privileged. Really from sort of top musicians and authors to, I don't know, people who've just arrived on the latest horrible migrant boat and everybody in between. And I think what it does teach you perhaps in the end is that no matter how grand people are, even if you're a million-selling author, in the end you're just as insecure as everyone else. And people do just want to tell their story. People just want to be listened to. And I think it's wonderful that there are people out there that want to hear, and it's been such fun for me just getting to know those people. And we were discussing before we started recording about how it makes such a difference being in the same room with someone. And, now in this digital age where we've all had to do this pivot and we're doing so much more online. But right now, you and I sitting here overlooking beautiful Richmond Park, it's a warm and an intimate moment, and it's lovely because of digital to be able to share that with your listeners. So we should introduce you. Georgina, like me, were born in Africa. Can you just share a little bit about what it was like to grow up in Zimbabwe, in Rhodesia before it was Zimbabwe, and how you ended up moving to London, how you ended up in radio, actually? So I was born in Chimanimani, which is a little village on the border of Mozambique and Zimbabwe, where my mother was the only doctor for about 2,000 square kilometres. And it was the height of the War of Independence in what was then Rhodesia. The country became independent when I was 13, I think, and so there was a big change, a lot of celebration, a lot of embracing of a new Zimbabwe. Certainly for my family, who were very liberal, had never believed in Ian Smith or any of that kind of white Rhodesian regime. Unfortunately, it became very clear that Mugabe was not a good thing after a while. And I began, even as a schoolgirl, I guess, to get quite into politics. And at school, there was a debating society, and I took part in it. And the society was asked to go to the radio station to take part in a shameless rip-off of the BBC show Just a Minute on the Zimbabwe Broadcasting Corporation. It was called Wait a Minute. And after I won it 2 or 3 times, the host didn't turn up. So they said, and I was 15 at the time, they said, well, you do it. And that was my start in radio, hosting that programme. And just then, every school holidays and all the rest of it. I got out of Zimbabwe as soon as I possibly could. I did my A-levels in the end in about 4 months because I'd applied for drama school, got accepted, and my parents said, well, you can go, but you can't go without your A-levels. So I kind of had to accelerate everything and leave, and came here to Britain, which was just such a relief because Zimbabwe really is a very small place, and so is Harare. Went to drama school here, ended up being quite a bad actress. I realised at some point I would never be Glenda Jackson, and then Glenda Jackson herself stopped being Glenda Jackson and went on to be a politician. And I went home on holiday, and while I was there, my parents gave me a puppy, and there's very little I won't do for a dog. So I stayed and met a boy and all the rest of it. And worked on the radio, and then was approached by a group of people who asked me if I would join in an action saying that it was unconstitutional for the Zimbabwe Broadcasting Corporation, my employers, to have a broadcast monopoly. And this case went before the Supreme Court, and in possibly one of the very last fair judgments, we were told that, yes, it was unconstitutional and actually we could go ahead and start a radio station. So I had to resign on air that morning. Bear in mind, at this point, I had a tiny, tiny little baby, about 10, 11 weeks old, and start on this new radio station that night. It meant kind of crawling around on the top of a tall building, the Monocle Hotel, for anybody who knows, right? Erecting the aerial and phoning my dad, who was a bit of a ham radio hack, saying, well, what frequency is free? And it was just extraordinary. And the radio station ran for a week until Robert Mugabe brought in a presidential decree saying that it was now illegal, and police came and they kicked down the doors and they took all the equipment away. And there was one thing for me that has always stayed with me and made me absolutely not jump to instant conclusions about people, in that I have always had a job, and I have always, I suppose, in some way, and this makes me sound like a terrible person, as indeed I possibly am, but looked down, if that's the word, or felt slight antipathy towards women who choose not to work. And I was back at work about a week after I had my baby, and it's just, I'm just a driven person, and I realise now I'm just different from them. People do things in different ways. But the thing that really, really made the difference to me was we were told that the police were coming to collect some equipment from the man who had lent it to us in order to do it. They were going to confiscate it. He had, just out of the kindness of his heart, lent us his equipment. He had nothing to do with the radio station, and yet they had a search warrant. That the building that his equipment was in, was surrounded by police, and it would have been very, very difficult for anyone to go in. And I tried to rally all my activist friends, and I called around them and said, we've got to help this guy. We've got to get his equipment out before the search happens tomorrow at 9 a.m. And they were all like, it's way too dangerous. There's police there. I called my Baby and Me yoga group of the women who stayed at home with their kids. And that night, we all went in with our baby buggies. We ordered some pizzas, we played some music, and when we left, our pushchairs were very, very heavy.
Full.
And so I utterly changed my mind, and I'd like to apologise to any woman that I have ever thought less of for not working.
I just remember coming into the UK the most recent time, perhaps, and Laurie was with me, my wife, and she asked me, the immigration officer said, and turned to Laurie, and she said, well, do you work? And what came out, I don't remember who said what, but the answer was, no, I don't work. I'm a mum, stay-at-home mum. And I was very proud to be able to say, Georgina, well, actually, my wife does work. She works in the home. And I like to say
Exactly.
she's
Yeah.
the chief family officer.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so I met you through Monocle and through the Hay Festival. Maybe you can just talk a little bit. The Monocle is an emerging brand. Hay Festival, I hope, is also an emerging brand. It's part of what the world needs. Maybe you can talk about your association with those two organizations. I think I'm particularly interested in Monocle as a subscriber. It's an unusual organization. I think it must be fun to be a part of, and I'd love to hear it from your perspective.
Absolutely, it's an extraordinary brand. Tyler Brûlé has built up this amazing company. He started at Wallpaper and then sold out there. Then I think there was a various sort of non-compete things, so he couldn't do anything with this idea he'd had for a while. And then just started building this media brand. He wanted a magazine, he got that. He wanted a film unit, he has that. He wanted a 24-hour radio station, he has that. There are now many, many more magazines. There's a whole publishing arm. Monocle brings out books. So it really is an entire media brand. For me, the way I started there was after I left Zimbabwe a few years later, my mother joined me after the death of my father. She wasn't able to cope there by herself. And here's me dissing non-working women, but I had to give up my job because I had a nanny looking after my child, and suddenly there was no space in the house because my mum was there. So I had to look after both child and mother. And that meant that I basically was at home looking after them both. And then my child went to senior school just around the corner from Monocle's offices, and my mother suddenly became bedridden. So actually, in a way, I was much, much freer than I had been for years. And so I took a job at Monocle reading the news because I could just go in and do a few shifts and come out again. But what I found was I got on very well with everyone there, and that their ideas really excited me around living well, around having the best life that you can have, around all of these different ways of looking at the world, a truly global outlook rather than the sort of parochial way I feel the British media tends to treat things. I mean, for instance, one of the main shows I present is called The Globalist, and it's an hour of current affairs every morning at 7 a.m. London time. And that's when the Today programme is on BBC Radio 4, which is traditionally the programme that people listen to here in the mornings to kind of set themselves up for the day. And it's always confrontational, or at least until recently it has been. It's always quite shouty. And, they'll bring in the minister and then not let him answer the question. But there's been shouting, and it's just I find it very, very difficult to listen to. And it's very tiny. Its worldview is very tiny. On Monocle, we'll do not just Belarus or Japan, but also Tanzania or I don't know. We're truly looking in a global way, and I think that's one of the things that makes it stand out. And for me, that goes very well with festival work. So, my brother is an author, and he's written a trilogy about our lives and our family growing up in Zimbabwe. So his name is Peter Godwin. The first book is called Mukiwa, A White Boy in Africa. And then there's When a Crocodile Eats the Sun. And then there is The Fear, The Last Days of Robert Mugabe, which I fear was published somewhat prematurely because it wasn't his last days for some time before I came out. But because of that, I would go to literary festivals with him where he was being interviewed. And I saw some really shocking interviews. And said to Peter Florence, who was the man until recently who ran Hay Festival, I said, I think I could probably do that. And so he gave me a shot. And it became one of my main lines of work. And it's been so much fun. But of course, it's all changed now. I mean, I think last year I went to 6 different countries chairing at different literary festivals. I was in Australia, I was in Pakistan, I was in Sri Lanka, I was in UAE, I can't even remember where else I was, and that's what the last few years have been like because I that's what I do. I interview people, and there's a certain demand for it. Of course, that's all changed now, but I think that events like Hay, and I know that you've been involved in Hay. Events like that are pivoting too, just like Monocle has done, getting more of a digital presence. And I think we're going to see more and more that events are hybrid, so there'll be a live element where perhaps, for instance, I did a festival a couple of weeks ago at Cheltenham where I was in the room with the authors. with a very socially distanced audience, and it was fantastic being back in the room. But what was even more interesting was that the capacity of the room, even had there not been social distancing, the capacity of the room was probably, 350 or something. Because it was social distanced, it was probably 50. But the online audience was 5,000.
Right.
And why would you ever come back from that?
Right.
I think that's the way it's going to be. Sadly, for people like me, though, it does mean that I'm probably not going to be flown around the world to talk to people. I think that's just things are changing.
You probably know more about it than I do, Georgina, but I think the physical world is going to come back with a vengeance, and people are very, very sick of Zoom calls. But I just wanted to say on Monocle, I think that one of the things that I admire about Tyler is that he imposes his view on the world. So there are things that he won't do, even if he could make money out of it. And what you see is, an authenticity and a loyalty to what he believes to be right about the world. And you don't have to agree with all of it. But there are some things that I love. And for example, Tyler identified radio as a medium that he wanted to be in. He doesn't seem to be interested in video. He doesn't have a YouTube channel. He's not interested in that.
Although we do have a whole film department, and you can see the films on the Monocle website, but it's not YouTube. You're absolutely right in that there isn't... So Monocle doesn't really tweet. It doesn't have an Instagram, but there are there are now a few tweets where we're pivoting slightly more that way. But you're absolutely right. He is a man with an absolute vision. I personally believe he's a genius.
Yeah.
And as you say, some people don't like it, but he knows what he wants, and he absolutely achieves it.
So at the time that I was living in New York, I knew that I had one opportunity to move anywhere. Pretty much. And so I was looking at quality of life indexes, and I realized now that, so one was Mercer, and there was one by The Economist, but there was another one that was hugely influential on me, done by Monocle. And around that time, I think they were kind enough to award Zurich the top slot, but it's a big part of why I chose to move to Zurich at the time. And it's quite extraordinary that the swimming pool that I like to go swimming at, Badi Utoke, is also a swimming pool that I know that Tyler likes to go swimming at. So it's fun to see businesses like that. So I guess let's just close with, tell us about some of the more interesting, or I'm sure they were all interesting, an interview that's fun to talk about for our particular audience that you've done, and if somebody is listening in who ends up getting interviewed by you, what they can expect.
I always like to ask people about their childhood. I think it's really important to know where people come from and what those early influences were and everything. And very recently I was interviewing Michael Morpurgo, who is the author of Warhorse and many, many other publications. And he said to me that his parents had split up during the war. His father had gone off to fight, and when they came back, found that they didn't really have much in common. Meanwhile, the mother had met someone else, and the father was very, very great about it and said, you know what, I just want my boys to have a stable upbringing. So what would be better is if I just go and leave you with your new husband, Mr. Morpurgo, and you all have a lovely life. So that was fine. He goes off to Canada, and Michael doesn't even really think about it. This happens when he's very, very young. And when he's about 19 or 20, he and his brother are sitting on the sofa with their mother, who suddenly they're watching Great Expectations on television. And suddenly the mother grips their knees and goes, "There's your dad." Well, the dad had moved to Canada where he was an actor. And there he was in Great Expectations. And Michael had no idea. After that, subsequent to that, he then built a relationship with him. But I just thought that was so lovely. And it wasn't something he told anybody else because nobody else had ever asked him, I think. And for me, it's little gems like that I'm always looking for. And, nothing is too mundane. When you look at anything closely enough, it's always interesting.
Well, as Georgina, I feel compelled to. It reminds me of the story of your brother's second book, where you obviously would be drawn to stories where somebody's father turns out to have something very different to what the child expected. And for those of you who haven't read the book, you'll have to read the book to find out what I'm talking about. But it gave me an extra connection to you, which was extraordinarily fun around being Jewish and having a Jewish identity, and how whether you decide to keep that identity or not, and whether you communicate that to your children or not. And that is a topic for a whole other conversation. But thank you so much for being willing to come and interview people that I bring onto this podcast.
Guy, I'm so thrilled to be doing it, and I'm so thrilled that you've introduced me to your audience, and I hope that that you'll stay with us both, because we've got lots and lots of exciting conversations to come.
Thank you.